Claire, we don't have time for non sequiturs. It's Pride Month. We gotta get right into it.
Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, it's time to go. Quick, 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 quick.
You're listening to Dot Femme.
Welcome to Dot Femme. I'm Danielle Gonzalez.
And I'm Claire.
There you go.
I forgot where we were for a second.
And today we're talking about the Stonewall Uprising, because it's Pride Month.
'Tis the season.
We kind of have to.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be great. I mean, not great. I don't know. Pride is a protest, and we need to remember that, especially in these times.
Yeah.
I keep commenting on TikTok threads where people are like, Pride is going to be so exciting this year. Oh my God, look at my outfit. And I'm like, Pride is a protest. Don't forget. It's a protest. It always has been.
Well, first, I want to start with busting a few misconceptions and myths about Stonewall.
Oh.
Because I notice, like, every year, it seems like people have this version of Stonewall that they tell that doesn't seem to be quite accurate.
Right.
So why don't we start with you, Claire? What's the version of Stonewall you know of? You've taken my queer history presentation.
I have.
Let's see if you pay attention.
I don't. So here's the thing. The way that, like, I've always kind of seen this as that, like, a bunch of ladies were hanging out in the bar because they were mourning the loss of someone. I can't remember who it was. And then, like, the police had a history of just, like, coming into bars around this time and harassing people, kind of like what we learned with the Compton cafeteria riots. Mm-hmm. And then, like, one day, or I don't know what instigated the whole thing, but, like, essentially somebody got fed up, if it was Marsha, if it was someone else, and the police, like, pulled someone out, and then a riot started going, and then someone threw a brick, and then, like, the next thing you know, we were fighting for liberation and all of our rights that thankfully still exist, but we're fighting hard for them right now. So that's kind of how I think about Stonewall. People were just, like, minding their own business, and then the police didn't want that to happen, so fuck the police.
All right. So that's a version of Stonewall, but there's a lot of myths and misconceptions in there. So let's break down some of the big ones.
Yeah, I think I'm missing a few details as well.
First, you mentioned that a bunch of ladies were in a bar mourning the death of someone.
Yeah.
There is the myth that goes around all the time that it started because the gay community was distraught by the death and funeral of Judy Garland.
That's right.
That's absolute nonsense.
Really?
Yeah. That's, in fact, a very insulting rumor that was created by a right-wing straight man who was writing about the event, like, days later in the Village Voice. He was mocking the event.
I feel so bad now. Oh my God.
You know, I think a lot of that myth comes out of, you've heard the phrase, like, are you a friend of Dorothy, right?
Yeah.
For anyone that doesn't know, being asked if you're a friend of Dorothy was a way that the queer community could help to identify each other when society was pretty antagonistic.
I see.
I say as if society's not currently antagonistic, but
yeah.
I think a lot of this comes from that. It created this concept that, like, the gay community was obsessed with Judy Garland and Dorothy and whatnot. But you have to keep in mind that Judy Garland was a major celebrity and figure in the late 40s and early 50s.
Yeah.
Stonewall happened in 69. So the young queer folks participating in Stonewall, they're not dancing to 20-year-old show tunes by Judy Garland. They're dancing to music of their time period. They couldn't care less about what had happened with someone
over the rainbow
who was popular 20 years ago. Yeah, that ends up being kind of like this insulting, mocking, rumor.
I had no idea. Oh my God.
It had nothing to do with Judy Garland's death.
Crazy.
You also mentioned that Marsha or someone threw the first brick.
Yeah.
And I hear this, or a version of this, a lot, that Marsha Johnson threw the first brick, Sylvia Rivera threw the first brick, Stormé DeLarverie threw the first, all different names. And there's a couple things here. Mm-hmm. it's so important to remember that this was a rebellion. It was a protest. This was not some kind of organized demonstration where they kept meticulous meeting minutes and, attendance.
Yep.
So there's no real way to know who was there at what time and who threw what first. Right?
Yep.
Not to mention that it may not have been bricks at all.
Right. I heard that they were throwing bottles and stuff too or something. Is that right?
Yeah. And we'll talk about the details about what actually happened. But yeah, I mean, if you listen to a lot of interviews of the young men and women who were there, a lot of them will say that I don't remember bricks being thrown. I'm not even sure where you would find a brick.
Yeah.
One interview that I saw was he talked about how the closest thing he could think of was some folks may have pried up some stones that were used to line tree planters and sidewalks, and they were brick sized, but they weren't
bricks. Yeah.
And that's I will say that that's semantics.
Yeah, I mean, what is a stone but a premature brick?
I think it is important to know though what the actual details are, because if we don't, I think we start to do some discredit. For example, Marsha P. Johnson was not there when the riots broke out. In an interview she gave in I think 2001, she said that she didn't arrive at the riots until about 2 a.m. She was uptown. She didn't get to downtown until 2 a.m. And by then the riots were already going.
Right.
As we talked about last week with Marsha and Sylvia and their organization STAR, I think, giving them appropriate attribution to their mark on queer history is important. And I wouldn't want to, I don't know if cheapen is the right word, but I definitely wouldn't want to sow confusion by saying the wrong facts and trying to give people an idea or a picture of something that didn't actually happen.
I mean, I'm kind of curious because they weren't there for the start of it. That was a result of police brutality that kind of instigated this whole thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't organized, it wasn't planned, but Marsha came in afterwards and she kept things moving. She kept that process going.
Yeah, she was part of that, but
yeah,
Marsha didn't do it alone.
No, of course. It's an organization, but she is our figurehead in this case. And
sure.
I don't know. I want to make sure that we recognize her contributions and make sure that,
Oh, sure. And we'll talk about it. The final thing, and this is one I've seen more recently, I've heard the phrase that the riots were televised. And first, I would like to say that, at least according to the people who were there, who participated, Stonewall was not a riot. It was a rebellion.
Right.
It was an uprising.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
That is a very important distinction to make.
Yeah.
And second, it wasn't televised. There was no photo or video of the first night when things kicked off. There, I think, were a couple photos of some of the subsequent nights, but the start of it, is all we have are the stories of the witnesses who were there. So
how did this thing how did this whole thing get started then? What was the catalyst at all?
Let's talk about what actually happened.
Oh yeah.
And first we have to, in order to really understand what happened at the Stonewall, we have to set the scene and talk about what life was like in New York in the 60s at this time. So in the 60s, being gay was a prosecutable crime, right? It was based on Victorian era anti-vagrancy statutes, which, by the way, some of those are still in place in many places across this country and others. But there was a department of the NYPD called the Public Morals Squad, or the Public Morals Division, and they were tasked with policing vice crimes. They were kind of I believe they were a precursor to modern police vice departments, right? They policed and prosecuted, well, not prosecuted, police don't prosecute anything, but they, policed and investigated.
Investigated is also arguable too.
Well,
Anyway, go on.
Lawyers prosecute, police don't prosecute. Yeah, so the Public Moral Squad was tasked with policing vice crimes, things like prostitution, gambling, drugs, alcohol, organized crime. And organized crime, the mafia, is a really big part of this story. While the Public Moral Squad was known for raiding a lot of gay bars, the official reason that they often gave for these raids wasn't actually to break up gay, gatherings and whatnot. It was was often violations of liquor statutes.
Yeah.
Selling alcohol without a license and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was because most of the gay bars in New York City at that time were operated by the mob, including the Stonewall Inn. The Stonewall Inn sits at Christopher Street, 7th Avenue in Greenwich Village, New York City, just across from Christopher Park.
I've been there.
That's cool. I haven't.
I'll tell you about it later. Tell us more about the mob. I want to know about the mob. I'm invested.
So a lot of times the mob paid the police. There was so much corruption in the NYPD at the time.
Yeah.
But the mob would pay the police for like advance notice that a raid was coming, stuff like that. On June 28th at 1:20 a.m., 1969, the Public Morals Squad of the NYPD entered the Stonewall and raided the establishment. The official charge was violating liquor statutes and selling liquor without a license.
Okay.
This was particularly unexpected for multiple reasons. First off, like I mentioned, the mob usually paid the police to get advance notice, and there was no advance notice on this night. Also, a lot of locations were very rarely raided more than once a week, and the Stonewall had been raided just a couple nights prior, so no one was expecting a back-to-back raid. And third, a lot of gay bars usually weren't raided on the same night that another bar was being raided. And it just so happens another bar was being raided. In fact, the fact that that bar was being raided is the reason why the Stonewall was so busy that night. The Stonewall, I think a lot of people have this very romanticized idea of the Stonewall Inn as being this like beloved and, you know, deep cornerstone of like the queer community in New York. No.
It's a dive bar.
It was an absolute shithole.
Yeah, it's still a dive bar too.
You know, the Stonewall like catered to queer clientele, but they weren't particularly queer friendly. They were run by the mob.
Right.
The drinks were watered down. You know, the bartenders were pretty sleazy and some of them got violent. It was not a particularly liked establishment. It just, the one that people wanted to go to that night was being raided. They had received an early tip-off, so people went to the Stonewall instead, which is why it was so busy that night.
What drew queer people to that bar if it was owned by the mob? Do we know? I'm just curious.
Well, it was because it was owned by the mob. It was kind of it was like a speakeasy, more or less.
Oh, it was a safe place. The mob didn't care as long as they were getting paid.
Safe-ish.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Maybe I spoke too soon.
No one was expecting this raid, and at 1:20 a.m. on June 28th, the police, you know, kick down the door, come in, announce the charges of selling liquor without a license, and because there was a criminal statute in New York that authorized the arrest of anyone not wearing at least 3 articles of gender-appropriate clothing.
Wild.
You know, it's an anti-cross-dressing statute.
Yeah.
The police were authorized to arrest patrons at the Stonewall.
Wild.
There were a lot of like trans and gender nonconforming folks who were forced to undergo genital inspections to verify their, quote, compliance with the statute.
Like they're doing to kids nowadays?
Sure. In fact, while the police were, quote, inspecting this gender non-conforming biracial butch lesbian named Stormé DeLarverie, they sexually assaulted her.
Fuck them.
She, you know, objected to it, told the police to get their hands off of her, stop groping her, and they arrested her for obstruction and led her outside to the patrol vehicle that was waiting. As they take Stormé out of the bar, a group is starting to gather outside, and Stormé sees them and shouts to them, "Why are you just standing there? What are you doing? Why don't you guys do something?" And that's considered the spark that set off the uprising.
Go Stormé. Stormé brought the storm.
Yeah.
It was too easy.
Someone shouts in response, it's because they weren't paid off, so people start throwing loose change at the police, you know, to pay them off in jest, you know. And loose change starts turning into shot glasses, which turn into beer bottles, which turn into stones and maybe bricks, but probably not bricks, but stones and rocks.
Premature bricks.
And that kicked off the whole thing. During this time, you know, you mentioned that Stonewall was a protest, and it was a protest. It was an uprising. but it was also kind of a celebration. During this time, the atmosphere of the uprising over the course of not just that night, but the subsequent days kind of fluctuated between these dramatic clashes with the police and this kind of calm block party atmosphere. Every once in a while, the police would kind of pull back to regroup before trying to push back into the neighborhood.
It was a party of a freedom of expression where people would just push back against police, be themselves, fight when they needed to, find community, coalitions.
It was a celebration of people recognizing their own agency. Right. And realizing that they shouldn't have to stand for this, and they don't have to stand for this, and they're not gonna stand for this.
Right.
And that, so it was a protest, but it was also kind of a celebration. To kind of demonstrate the celebratory atmosphere of sorts. This is probably my favorite story that I've heard.
Oh, good. I thought you were going to ask me to cheer or something. I was like,
We'll get there.
Okay.
But probably one of my favorite stories from Stonewall that I've ever heard, which is apparently at multiple different times across not just the first night, but the subsequent days, the young men and queer folks that were there would form a Rockette-style kick line.
Yes.
And they would face off against the police in this, show-tuney kick line while singing custom lyrics to the tune of Howdy Doody Time. Do you know Howdy Doody Time, Claire?
It's Howdy Doody Time. It's Howdy Doody Time.
So, I have the lyrics here. Why don't you sing the song that they would sing when they did their kick line?
So it goes, we are the Stonewall girls. We wear our hair in curls. We don't wear underwear to show our pubic hair.
There you go.
I love it.
And so I just imagine this line of queer folks doing this song kick line, from one edge of the street to the other edge of the street, just building to building, holding the police back, singing that. Incredible.
Yeah.
This was the Stonewall Uprising. It's in full swing. It lasted for, anywhere between 3 and 5 days. I think it's commonly said that it lasted 5 days. Some places say it lasted 2 weeks. A lot of folks that were there say it was about 3 days long. And it's very difficult because there was a lot of, media coverage, a lot of, newspaper articles about, the rambunctious queers are, causing trouble and blah, blah, blah. And so there were a lot of homophobic articles written about the uprising.
Of course.
And subsequent protests that were protesting those specific articles also happened in that time period, and they kind of blended together. So it's hard to say when the actual Stonewall Uprising ended and what was subsequent, protests.
Sure.
Dot Femme is brought to you by, not capitalism, that's for damn sure.
We're powered by queer joy and caffeine, baby!
And our Patreon supporters. Want to help us keep making weird little episodes like this one? Head to patreon.com/dotfemme. That's patreon.com/dotfemme. Something that I think we don't talk about a lot when it comes to Stonewall that I think is very important, especially now in this day and age, is that other civil rights movements made appearances in solidarity, either at Stonewall proper or in subsequent demonstrations. For instance, the Black Panther movement. So while the Black Panther movement didn't attend Stonewall in any kind of large or organized capacity, there have been a couple of individual members of the Black Panther movement that did show up in some of the subsequent evenings.
Yeah.
And later, the Black Panther movement did issue an official statement of support for the gay liberation movement, in addition to women's liberation movement that was happening at the time and the anti-war movement that was happening at the time and all that.
That's solidarity for sure. Yeah.
It's right. It's, long before the term intersectionality existed.
Oh, yeah.
People were coming together and recognizing this sort of intersectional fight that we all kind of experience.
Yeah.
So we know, as we talked about in like episode 1 with Compton's, we know that like the fight for queer liberation didn't start at Stonewall.
No, it's been going on since the Mattachine Society, as far as I recall.
It's been going on long before that.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
But Stonewall it did mark this sort of major shift. It was a major catalyst for change in the fight for queer liberation. Directly out of Stonewall, folks who were there, the witnesses and the people that attended, banded together to form the Gay Liberation Front, as well as other organizations like the Gay Activist Alliance. But the Gay Liberation Front is especially notable. First off, they were named after the National Liberation Front groups of Algeria and Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah, and this is also during the Vietnam War, right? So like Americans were fighting, they were fighting the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, who, you know, were called the Viet Cong, which my understanding, I'm not Vietnamese, so I don't know, but my understanding is that is a somewhat offensive term these days. So, you know, maybe don't throw that one around. But yeah, the Gay Liberation Front was sort of named as a kind of unofficial nod to, you know, the Vietnamese National Liberation Front and the Algerian National Liberation Front, which were both happening right at around that same time.
That's crazy.
To kind of demonstrate this comparison that was happening about people's liberation in general.
Yeah.
So they formed on July 31st, 1969, so like a month after Stonewall happened. It was a meeting of over like 40 people who attended. They all decided that they needed to break away from existing gay and lesbian organizations like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis.
Oh, yeah.
Because they felt that they weren't doing enough, that they were kind of...
Well, like, it's just older, right? You know, it's just an older, like, the fight that they were fighting for, or, you know, could still be fighting for today. Like, you know, it's as you liberate, right? Like, the problems change, the problems, you know, evolve, they shift, they move.
Right.
And so, like, you know, I think AIDS is a good example where in the 80s and 90s, you know, like, you needed to be prioritizing AIDS. Like, it was all about making sure AIDS was being addressed and, you know, like, researched and treatments were being brought into the community. But like today, like the fight for AIDS is still really, really important, but the movement has shifted away from AIDS, but it's still this equally important place.
Sure.
Like, you know, if we were still fighting for AIDS today, we would just be doing a disservice to the community. Because we've made a lot of progress on that fight. And so I think just as like, you know, as activist groups do, they evolve, they change, they grow in sizes, right?
Right.
And, you know, priorities shift. That's what happens. Like, and I don't know, it's a good thing that priorities shift. Priorities should be shifting. That is change. That is activism. That is movement forward. So...
Yeah, so the Gay Liberation Front, their stated goal was to confront all forms of sexism and male supremacy, which, you know, in their view was the source of all LGBT oppression.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is a view that I agree with.
Yeah.
So they held like weekly protests at the Women's House of Detention, also called the House of D, which was in Greenwich Village. It was a women's prison that was known for racial discrimination, physical and sexual abuse, and gender discrimination.
And this is the Gay Liberation Front? They've been like...
Yeah. Gay Liberation Front. They, you know, tried to form coalitions with other radical groups working to create worldwide social revolution, like, you know, the Black Panther movement and the anti-war movement and the hippie movement, all of these groups kind of coming together. They declared support for a broad political platform opposing racism, capitalism, traditional gender roles, all, like we said before, long before the modern concept of intersectionality was a thing. They were demonstrating it.
Right.
You know, they were living intersectionality.
Do we know how long, like the Gay Liberation Front was formed in 1969, but do we know about how long they've been active, or are they still active? Did they disband, or just...
I believe they are still active in some way, but it's also important to know that a lot of the members that started the GLF sort of spun off a bunch of other groups, like, you know, like STAR that we talked about last week, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, groups like Radical Lesbians, the Third World Gay Revolution, ACT UP, Lesbian Avengers, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
Oh, I know them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like them. They're nice. Okay, so a little pet peeve of mine. There are areas within the United States that celebrate Pride Month in like July or August. And I'm so mad that they do that because I'm like, you need to like, it needs to be all in one place. It needs to be all in one time, you know, like I don't know why people do it in August.
Well, I can tell you exactly why people do it at different times.
Really? There's a reason for this? I just thought it was like budget or something.
Yeah, it's all logistics. It's all scheduling and logistics.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I'm glad it exists, but like I've had students in the past who are like, it's August, it's Pride Month. And I'm like, you're in Kentucky and you're celebrating Pride Month in August? Like, I don't know. But
I mean,
anyway.
I get it, and I'm not as much of a stickler about when Pride Month happens.
Sure.
You know, as long as the spirit of Pride Month is there. And I do think that like it's, you know, Pride Month exists to celebrate the anniversary of the uprising on June 28th, right? So I think as long as you're doing that,
yeah,
you know, your actual Pride Month can be whenever, but just don't forget the 28th of June, right?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, as a country, we've done pretty well at trying to remember, and hopefully we don't go backwards. But, you know, I mean, in 2016, President Barack Obama designated the site of Stonewall a national monument, which included the Stonewall in itself, but also Christopher Park across the street and the surrounding streets and sidewalks where the uprising happened. And this is something I didn't know before I did research for this episode. In 2019, the New York City Police Commissioner, James P. O'Neill, I don't know if he's still the commissioner, but he was the commissioner in 2019. He issued an apology to the global queer community, and especially the queer community in New York, on behalf of the police department, saying, quote, "The actions taken by the NYPD that night were wrong, plain and simple."
Only took them 50 years.
Well, and that's what a lot of queer leaders, especially those who were there were a lot of queer leaders who were there who responded to the statement.
Yeah.
And they described the statement as being welcome, surprising, and also long overdue.
Yeah, seriously.
And it did only take them 50 years, but I also could have conceived of a future where they said literally nothing ever.
Yeah.
So it is kind of nice. You know, it is still nice that they said something.
I don't know if forgiven is the right word, but I will take the apology.
I do want to end from this passage from the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto from 1971. They wrote, "If we are to succeed in transforming our society, we must persuade others of the merits of our ideas, and there is no way we can achieve this if we cannot even persuade those most affected by our oppression to join us in fighting for justice. We do not intend to ask for anything. We intend to stand firm and assert our basic rights. If this involves violence, it will not be we who initiate this, but those who attempt to stand in our way to freedom." So,
and that was from the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto in 1971.
1971.
Yeah.
Yep. And I wholeheartedly agree. I think, you know, they make a convincing argument for all of us to come together and recognize, you know, our shared struggle, not just queer folks, you know, but like women who are facing reproductive care being rolled back and stripped from them, and immigrants who are being deported and held unjustly, and, you know, the folks who are poor and being crushed by the yoke of billionaires and whatnot. So I think they make a very important argument for how we're going to succeed and what we need to do that. So
Agreed.
Yeah. Stonewall is very important, you know, and I think that because we're more than 50 years removed from it now, and I think there are a lot of folks in our generation who only know Pride as, you know, Pride parades and Pride Month block parties, right?
Right.
But I think it's very important to remember the uprising that started Pride Month. Didn't start the fight for queer liberation, but started Pride Month.
Yeah, we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, and the Gay Liberation Front, which, I mean, I would make the argument that all of the progress we've had over the past 50 years is because of them. All of it.
Yeah.
You know, so.
It was the spark.
Yeah, that was it. Well, I suppose we should let people get to their Pride celebrations. We have Pride celebrations to get to.
We do.
Everyone go get to your Pride celebrations. Thank you for joining us for this Pride Month episode of Dot Femme. If you like what we do here, You can find us on Blue Sky. You can support us by subscribing to this podcast, listening to other episodes wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Deezer, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're pretty much everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
If you have queer history that you want us to talk about, or, you know, stories or anything like that, you can contact us through the contact form on our website, or you can write to us at our P.O. Box, which we check every week. And, you know, as always, support us on Patreon if you like what we do and you want us to keep doing this fun queer content. At least I hope it's fun. You know, toss a couple bucks at us on Patreon. We have some, you know, fun rewards for you over there.
You were going to say toss a coin to a Witcher, were you?
No, I was not. I don't think that's a thing anymore. Wasn't that like 4 years ago?
Maybe.
With that, I've been Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.